Zoom therapy office.
Wow, that's cool.
I'm in the room that I devote to your book.
Are you working these days at the writer space?
Yeah, I have been. It's been great.
How crowded is it?
I mean, it's been pretty full lately, but I just heard from Scott that they're actually going to open the other desks now. And so
I've never been to the new one. I only know the one on Garfield.
it's great. I absolutely love it. I was so relieved to be back. It just was liberating.
So is Scott
Um,
still in Brooklyn?
Yes.
are y'all ready to get started?
We are.
All right, perfect. I am gonna hit broadcast, and then there'll be like 15 to 20 seconds of awkward silence as I just give folks a chance to get logged into Zoom here before we get started. Just a
Okay.
warning. So we are recording now. Hi, folks. We're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started with tonight's event. If you are already logged into tonight's Zoom webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Joshua Henkin, presenting his new book, Morningside Heights. He'll be talking with Julie Orenger, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Joshua, Julie, and the team at Pantheon for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. If you're joining via Zoom webinar, there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. If you're joining through YouTube Live, you don't have access to these interactive tools, but you can still enjoy the conversation. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Morningside Heights, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week. And you can purchase Joshua's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. Joshua is stopping by our store to sign copies of the book, so you can get a signed or even personalized book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request and order comments at checkout when ordering online, or look for signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Julie Orenger. She is the award-winning author of The Flight Portfolio, The Invisible Bridge, and How to Breathe Underwater. She teaches at NYU and has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, Dow Colony, and Yaddo. She's at work on a new collection of stories. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Joshua Henkin. He is the author of the novels Swimming Across the Hudson, a Los Angeles Times notable book, Matrimony, a New York Times notable book, and The World Without You, winner of the 2012 Edward Lewis Wallace Award for Jewish American Fiction and a finalist for the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. His short stories have been published widely, cited for distinction in Best American Short Stories, and broadcast on NPR's Selected Shorts. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and directs the MFA program in fiction writing at Brooklyn College. His new book, Morningside Heights, is a sweeping and compassionate novel about a marriage surviving hardship. The book has been praised by such acclaimed authors as Sigrid Muniz, Anne Nano, Elizabeth Strout, and tonight's interviewer, Julie Orringer, who says, "In the sheer pleasure of reading Joshua Henkin's new novel, of following its swift narrative movements, getting to know its all-too-human characters, inhabiting its detail-perfect settings, its relentlessly accurate portrayals of marriage and parenthood and siblinghood, we can almost forget, for moments on end, that its subject is one of the most painful imaginable, the loss of a self, of a marriage, of a shared life. But the real magic of Morningside Heights is the way it lifts us up, reminding us that ordinary people undertake extraordinary acts of survival every day." Joshua is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Julie and with all of you. Joshua, please take it away.
Thank you. I just want to say just a couple of words. Thank you so many of you for being here. We all wish that we were doing this live, but one of the nice things about doing it online is that people can be here who otherwise couldn't be here. And I feel it's kind of like the Zoom bar mitzvah that I never had. And I also want to say a special thank you to a bunch of people here whom I've actually never met, but whom I've corresponded with over the past months who are independent booksellers. And I just want to say how grateful I am for the support that independent booksellers have given this book. And so I'm happy, really happy you're here joining us. I'm going to read very briefly from a section in the book. The novel is about a long marriage between a Columbia professor and his wife, and the professor develops early Alzheimer's. But before he gets married before Spence and Prue get married, Spence had a previous marriage, and there was a son named Arlo. And this is a brief backstory section about Arlo, who is grown up largely away from Spence and Prue, and living with his hippie-ish mother in various places around the country. So that's where the section comes from. It's on page 51 if people are following along. Arlo Zakheim always got wind of things. He didn't have ESP exactly. He was simply more intuitive than other people. This helped him, he believed, in business and in life. He liked to have the maximum information about others while revealing the minimum information about himself. He listed his phone numbers as anonymous so that people wouldn't know who was calling. Sometimes, just for the kick of it, he would leave an automated email message. "I don't feel like checking email today. I'll get back to you when the urge overtakes me." But all the while, he was secretly checking. "You hate surprise," his mother told him once. Who could blame him? His own childhood had been so replete with surprise. The only constant was the surprise itself, starting with his parents' divorce when he was only 8 months old. He was convinced he could remember his parents together, but his father told him that was impossible. Arlo didn't care what his father said. He'd spent his whole life trying to forget his father, even as he yearned for him from afar. and he considered the word impossible a challenge. Impossible to hold your breath for as long as he'd held his as a baby, holding it until he turned blue. People spoke about iron wills, but scientists had yet to discover a will as strong as his. He had run 2 marathons 48 hours apart, 200 push-ups, fasting for days, lying in a hyperbaric chamber, extreme caving, tantric sex, dry orgasm. He didn't care what his father said. He remembered his parents together, recalled his father saying, well, good goddamn. His father who never cursed, who referred to it as cussing, who called dog shit dog dirt. I hate my father. Of course you do, his mother said, good at encouraging that hatred while pretending not to. Who wouldn't hate someone who abandoned him? That's not what happened. But Arlo didn't know what had happened. He just knew it was more complicated than his mother let on. Things are always more complicated, his mother said, and at the same time, they're really quite simple, which was how his mother spoke in koans, her meaning as obscure as her gaze. By the time he turned 10, Arlo had lived in so many places, he had trouble remembering them all. His mother had once told him she wanted to poop in all 50 states. In this way, she was following in the footsteps of her father, a kosher butcher, who had moved the family from state to state, always in search of an underserved Jewish community. If Arlo had been older and more sophisticated, he would have realized his mother was visiting upon him what her father had visited upon her. He would have recalled the words of the prophet Jeremiah, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth have been set on edge. But Arlo hadn't read the Bible at that point, or much else for that matter. One day, Arlo picked up the receiver and heard his parents on the phone. What about his schooling, his father said. It's required by law. The law? Why, Arlo's mother wanted to know. Should she follow the law when the cops were pigs and the district attorney was too, when every lawyer was corrupt, from the lowest ambulance chaser all the way up to the attorney general? Had Arlo's father forgotten about Vietnam? Had he forgotten about the Gulf of Tonkin and the Pentagon Papers and My Lai? No, Arlo's father sighed, he hadn't. But it was beside the point, a red herring. He was talking about their son's education, and what kind of education was Arlo getting when Linda was moving him from place to place. Is that all you care about, education? Listen, Linda. Arlo's father's voice was as steady as his mother's was deranged. His father's very calmness set his mother off. The more placid he became, the more ill-tempered it made her. I am listening, she said. What else is there for me to do but listen to you? He's getting an education. I'm homeschooling him. Arlo stifled a laugh. He'd been in and out of a dozen schools, never staying long enough to gain traction. You have a native intelligence, his mother said. Now you just have to go out and cultivate it. That it was her responsibility to help him cultivate it never occurred to her. He did have a native intelligence, but he read poorly, which shamed him, and his classmates mocked him for his reading, which shamed him even more. Soon he started to skip school. His mother, busy at the cafe or bookstore or art supplier, at whatever job she'd secured that month, was too tired to fight him. If you want to play hooky, it's your loss. But secretly she was grateful for his company. So when he said, you could homeschool me, she said, I don't see why not. She would take him to the library, and she would become mesmerized by the rows of books, the little round stickers of the Dewey Decimal System lined up like shirt buttons on their spines. I'm like a child in a candy store, his mother said, but a child who looked at the candy without buying any, because they would leave the library without having borrowed any books. At the local diner, Arlo's mother would flip through USA Today to the microflash of news from each of the 50 states. Okay, I'm going to homeschool you. Tell me which state this is from. But Arlo wasn't good at geography, and he couldn't possibly have known whether the home fire that killed a grandmother and her 2 grandchildren had been set in Minnesota or Vermont, or whether Arkansas was where the power had gone out, and so he was just guessing. Here, his mother said, explain to me about ERAs, and Arlo, who liked baseball and was good at math, wrote the figures on a napkin. But Arlo's mother wasn't good at math, and Arlo had to repeat the process, so if anyone was being homeschooled, it was her. Arlo's father said, "You're homeschooling him, Linda? I'm not sure what qualifies you to do that. You know how I feel about the American education system." "I'm not talking about the American education system. I'm talking about our son. What are you teaching him?" "Math, geography, social studies, physics." "Physics," he said. "You're teaching Arlo physics?" This Arlo thought was typical of his mother. She would get caught in the bramble of her deceit, and soon she'd be sounding ridiculous. Maybe it was those very words, geography and physics, that magnified her lie, but hearing her say them made him cough. Now his parents realized he was on the phone, and his mother was saying, "Arlo, you can't go snooping around like that." But his father said, "Wait a second, Linda. Arlo, can I have a word with you?" The phone felt heavier in Arlo's hand, and in the midday sun that pulsed through the blinds, he started to sweat. "How are you, Arlo?" "I'm okay," he said, but whenever he spoke to his father, he realized he was less okay than he'd thought. "I have to go," he said, and as he hung up, he heard his father say, "I love you, Arlo," the sound percussing as he walked out of the apartment and down the road, past the gas station and the laundromat and the check cashing store, the pawn shops flashing even in daytime. If his father loved him, why didn't he come get him? Why did they only spend July together and a week over Christmas and a week over spring break? Secretly, Arlo slept with his father's shirt, which he'd filched on a visit to New York. His father would have given him that shirt, but the filching had been important, just as the secrecy of sleeping with it was important, knowing he was betraying his mother by sleeping with his father's shirt. Okay, I'm gonna stop there because reading is boring and conversation is bitter, and I want to hear from Julie and then from all of you. So, Julie, take it away.
Josh, I'm so excited that we've reached this day, and I think I echo all of the comments in the chat. Everybody is so thrilled to be here, and it was so wonderful to hear you read these pages of the book. I've had this novel in my mind for a long time because I read a version of it a few years ago now. But I must say that it's just thrilling to know that it's soon going to be going out into the world. And so before we launch into the questions, I want to just say publicly how much I've loved hearing you talk about fiction over the years that we've been teaching together. We've talked about it with regard to our own work. We've talked about our students' work. We've talked about what we've loved reading. And one thing that has been consistent over the course of our conversations is how much I think we both appreciate the harmony between foreground and characterization and narrative movement. And this is something that this book has in marvelous quantity on all sides. So I want our conversation to move swiftly to the craft of fiction and how you arrive at what I think is an incredible literary feat of combination of craft elements that are sometimes difficult to synchronize. But first, because I know a lot of people are going to be interested in that, I would love to hear you talk about the origins of the book, how the idea first arrived on your plate, and maybe how it changed in its conception, from conception over the years of its generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Julie. So, like Spence, my father was a professor at Columbia, and like Spence, my father developed dementia. Although fortunately, he developed it much later in life, whereas Spence got it earlier. And when my father was declining, my mother briefly attended a class for caregivers. I believe it was at the JCC in Manhattan. It was definitely on Manhattan's Upper West Side. And I was really struck by that because my mother is very much not a kind of consorting with strangers person. She's a consorting with her friends and colleagues kind of person. And I was interested in how, the stage that she'd gotten to, such that she took comfort in talking with people with whom she had really nothing in common except for the fact that they were all caregivers. And so I wrote a draft of a very long story, it was about 100 pages long, that took place entirely at the JCC, and it took place between Prue and a number of people she meets who are in the same boat as her, and they're kind of rowing together. But pretty quickly, it became apparent to me that wasn't really the story I wanted to tell, and that that I was really interested in the family. And so, I wrote probably a few hundred drafts. I wrote 3,000 pages along the way, but probably, somewhere in about year 4 or 5 of the writing, the JCC entirely disappeared. And so, yeah, it was the inspiration, but it's no longer there.
Hmm. And so it's interesting that your interest in the narrative expanded from that initial point, which really was a single point of view, and now this is a multi-voiced novel. And maybe by way of beginning to delve into some issues of craft, I would want to ask you to talk about how the point of view expanded and how you chose this particular way of telling, how you felt that it was necessary to voice these other characters who are more peripheral to that like central core of narrative that initiated the book.
Right. I mean, I think there were several struggles for me. I try to always come up with a reason for why it takes me so long to write a book. Um, so here are some of my reasons. Um, so I think every novel presents different challenges, and I think the one of the principal challenges of any book that's about someone with Alzheimer's is that if it's taking place in the world as we know it, if it's not a speculative book, and my book is not a speculative book, then there really is no tension in the question of what's going to happen medically. Sadly and inevitably, it's going in one direction. And I always tell my grad students this: you don't want to write a story or a novel about a ball rolling down a hill because the ball is going to roll down the hill. Um, and I also wasn't really interested in telling the book from Spence's point of view, at least while he's declining. It isn't his point of view some while he's not declining, but I wasn't interested in telling like what it's like for someone with dementia to experience dementia. I think people have done that well. It just doesn't interest me. It feels to me like a more performative kind of writing than I tend to go in for. Um, but so I realized that the tension in the book had to be around the characters who didn't have dementia and how they, responded to what was happening, interacted with Spence, etc. So, in a lot of ways, I don't feel like it's a book about dementia. I mean, I feel like dementia is the engine that starts the book, and that in some ways drives the book. But I see it as a novel about a family and about a marriage over many, many years. And when you have a marriage over many, many years, you have a lot of things going on, and you have a lot of characters who drop in and drop out. And so, in some ways, although Spence is the fulcrum of the book, it's really Prue's book and Arlo's book and various other characters' books. And so, those were the characters whom I was most interested in.
Well, it strikes me, hearing you speak about it, that one of the things that the book is really about, if we want to talk about it that way, is a search for a sense of self. And as Spence declines, we see each of the characters having to kind of reevaluate their a sense for who they are in the world and how they define themselves. One of the ways that a lot of the characters define themselves in the book is through their work. And I was wondering how you arrived at your ideas about the kind of work that you wanted each of these characters to perform and what role that was going to play and how that work evolved over the course of your revising the book.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor once said that a fiction writer can't do without a certain measure of stupidity. And some of us come by it naturally, and others have to cultivate it. At least the kind of fiction I write, I don't really believe in ideas. I mean, I think I probably have ideas somewhere in my brain, and they come in through the back door. But so I didn't, for instance, think about work in the abstract. I mean, I totally know, Julie, what you're talking about, but I always start with the particular and to get at the general, as opposed to starting with the general to get at the particular. So I kind of have to sort of like retrospectively and try to figure out what I was doing. But so I start with character, and I try to put my characters in a situation where things can happen. And I think, Spence is someone who very deeply identifies with his work and who actually really deeply identifies with his brain.
Right.
In that sense, he is like my father, who I think, my father very begrudgingly, accepted the fact that he had a body, but only really, really begrudgingly. And I think that's what Spence is like. And I think, so that's who Spence was. But, in a lot of ways, if it's any character's book, I refuse to choose among my characters, but in a lot of ways it is Prue's book.
That's
She's
right.
probably the point of view character. He's probably the character in whose head we are in the most. And what I was really interested in, so, Prue grew up in the Midwest and went to Yale. She was and I could be wrong about this because it's a long time since I've read the book, but she was either in the first or second class of women admitted to Yale. I think she graduated in 72, if I'm remembering. And then she went on to starting a PhD in English literature at Columbia. And then she met Spence and married him, and things took a direction that she hadn't anticipated. And I was really interested in writing about what it's like for a character who's very intelligent and accomplished in her own right to really hitch her star to her husband. I mean, obviously, this is certainly wasn't uncommon in the 60s and 70s, and may not be uncommon today. But I do think that Prue is someone who one might have thought wouldn't have ended up where she was. At least she would have thought that she wouldn't have ended up where she was. And so I think her sense of identity is really, really tied up with Spence's work. And so when Spence declines, in a weird way, I think she feels like she's declining too. And so she really has to, reinvent herself, as you're saying. And then Arlo, who's really not around the family that much, except for a couple of years when he's a teenager, is really, on some level, at least he perceives himself, the family disappointment. Spence values a certain very traditional kind of knowledge,
Right.
and Arlo is dyslexic and doesn't have that kind of knowledge. And Spence thinks that, if Arlo will just bear down and study harder for the SAT and learn more vocabulary words, all will fall into place. And that's just not who Arlo is. And Arlo, to me, Arlo it might be the most interesting character in the book because has a real sense of both wanting to please his father, and he's really angry at his father, and he's both needy and aggrieved, and he's complicated. So I think in a weird way, just to get back to your specific question, Julie, I think that that everyone is defined by Spence's work. And Spence is defined by Spence's work. And yeah.
But let's talk about Sarah for a minute. Because she is in her adult years in the book, she's a medical student. And it's an interesting choice to have a character who has a kind of proprietary knowledge about the process that, her father is going through at the time. And that was a specific choice that you made. I love that because I feel like in stories where there's there's a question of health or where the body feels particularly vulnerable, I often feel like it's those who have the greater medical knowledge who are also more at sea because they recognize the incapacity of medicine to fully understand or to be able to address the problem. And there's this marvelous scene where Sarah's talking to Prue, and Sarah mentioned some of the research that she's been doing into ApoE4 and 3 and into certain tau proteins that are present in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. And her mother says, I can't even begin to understand it. And Sarah says, well, neither do they. That's really the problem. And it just struck me that that was such a marvelous example of that recognition of the art of medicine. And in sort of that same vein, just the ways in which we have to feel our way into the treatment of ill understood diseases. And I guess the question that I'm asking you has something to do with whether that was a conscious choice for the book, or whether that was one of those choices that you found yourself making and then recognized the potential resonance of as you were working.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think much more the latter. I mean, I don't want to pretend to be dumber than I am. Like I do make some conscious choices, certainly in like drafts 4 or 10. And I actually think pretty analytically, so I do map things out. But making Sarah a doctor was pretty instinctive. And I think, I mean, you're right, but I didn't consciously think about how interesting that she's a doctor while her father has this disease, because she becomes a doctor before he has the disease. She goes to medical school before. And I think my idea behind Sarah becoming a doctor was more that to get it, I think she's in a sort of tough position because she is sort of the golden child, and unlike Arlo, she has succeeded by her father's standards, but I think she's uncomfortable about that. And I think that, so I see it much more as she goes to medical school because that feels like an appropriate kind of choice for someone from her station, but
Mhm.
also sufficiently different from what her parents have done. And also, she's moving out to Southern California for medical school. She does not go to medical school in New York, although she has the option to. So I see it more as being in opposition to to who her parents are, even as she's in sort of allied with them. But I actually think, I mean, it does remind me of something else, but I think does address what you're getting at, Julie, which is that, in an early, this might have been true in the draft you saw. I mean, Julie's been kind enough not to say this, but I burdened Julie and actually 3 or 4 other people who are on this chat with a 753-page draft of this book. And I think it's fair to say that it, in a certain way, it's hard to believe, kind of a tight draft, and so the scenes were tight, but the novel was sagging in various ways. And we can talk more about that when we get to specifics of craft. But anyhow, in an earlier draft of the book, Spence was not a Shakespeare professor, but an art historian. And I actually think that was in the draft that I showed you. And you might have said this, or a couple of people said this to me. They said, I just don't believe that Spence is an art historian. And I knew it. I knew he wasn't an art historian. I think it's part because I don't know enough about art history, but also because he's like deeply an ascetic, deeply not about the physical. And I guess you could have an art historian who's ascetic, but it's harder. But the reason I'm raising this is, writers talk about killing their darlings. And the obvious thing for me to do would have been to just like, okay, have him not be an art historian. But I really dragged my feet for a long time on that. And the reason for that is that my favorite scene in the book was really contingent on his being an art historian. My favorite scene in the book, it's probably still my favorite scene in the book, but it's not in the book, was a scene while Spence is declining, pretty far along, but he still hasn't been diagnosed. And he and Prue go to a relative's bat mitzvah. And there's a moment when Spence disappears and Prue is looking for him. And all of a sudden, the paradigmatic bat mitzvah slideshow is appearing on screen. The lights have gone down, and the girl's father is, narrating the slideshow. And Spence goes up and takes the pointer from him and starts to conduct an art history lecture. And it is both what he says about it is both kind of utterly brilliant and utterly incoherent. He's chalking art history terms while the bat mitzvah girl is, scuba diving in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think if I'm allowed to say so, I think it was a really good scene. I think it was funny and poignant And it kind of poked fun at bat mitzvah videos and also captured the ways in which people who have dementia can be both lucid and not lucid at the same time. And I just wanted to do anything to save that scene. And I even after I changed him to a Shakespeare scholar, I tried to still keep that scene. And finally, I just gave up that scene. So I think, all that's my way of saying is that you can become attached to something that is not good for the book.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about what changed, what else you lost, or what else you gained as the book moved from that original 750-page draft to where it is now. I mean, I think this. I've spoken a bit about it to our students. Just how monumental this revision was. I would love it if you could give us a sort of précis of your heaviest lifting between those drafts.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, I do believe that when I tell my students something, I have to live by it myself. And so, I'm always telling my students that I think big changes at the roots of a tree are more effective than many changes at the branches of a tree. And, sometimes I'll tell a grad student to, I mean, I'm probably more prescriptive than many teachers and probably more prescriptive than I should be. But, I'll say something like, you should do the following 7 things. And the writer will often do those 7 things and the story feels exactly the same. And so I do think revision is very much about revision, seeing something afresh. And I think all writers have strengths and weaknesses. And one of my strengths is I'm a good reviser. And what I mean that is I actually mean that like I'm temperamentally a good reviser. I'll sometimes say to a student, have you ever thought of doing this? And it's like a big change in their story. And they'll say, no. And I'll say, well, are you willing to think about it? And, sometimes they'll say yes, and sometimes they'll say no. And I'm not saying that they should necessarily say yes. Sometimes, making a big change that so changes your artistic vision isn't going to work. But I do think people can be too precious about their artistic visions. And
You wouldn't reflexively say no when somebody made a suggestion. You would say,
right.
why is a person making that suggestion?
Right. In other words, I really believe that people should be open to anything. I don't mean that they should do anything, but I mean they should be open to anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen this among my students and among my fellow writers, and something I try to avoid myself is a kind of inflexibility with like, nope, this is my vision. And I feel like, okay, but if you modify your vision, might you be able to make the book work better? So that's like a prelude to enter the specifics about the book. And again, I have to sort of like, it's hard to remember what you did when, but here are a few like fundamental heavy lifting things that had to happen in terms of the book. Well, so first of all, Arlo wasn't even in the book originally. This is before the draft you saw. So
What?
yeah, so some point, this is an issue you struggle with. Like, this is true in the world without you also. That's a book about a journalist who's killed in Iraq, and there's a family reunion. And in an early draft of the book, that's just all the book was about. And a writer friend of mine has been a great critic for me. And he kind of said, well, the book is sad, but you'd expect it to be sad. But what if the parents are splitting up? And as soon as so that's a big change at the roots. That's the entry point into that book. It'd be unimaginable, that book, without the parents splitting up. But it wasn't until the 10th draft that the parents were splitting up. So I think that book, but here too, you're dealing with something that's sad. A son dying in that book, Alzheimer's in this book. And you want fiction to defamiliarize the familiar or familiarize the unfamiliar, or both. But the problem with writing about Alzheimer's being sad is that you can do a better or worse job of that, but it's kind of predictable. It's like, it's sad. And so I was interested in trying to make the book funny, even as it was also sad, or other things. So I wanted variety. I'm a big believer in variety on a sentence level, just cadences, sentence rhythms, but also on a macro level. And so at some point I said, what if Spence had a previous marriage and had a kid? It popped into my head, and I kind of said, nah, I don't think that's going to work. But I said, why don't you try it? And as soon as I tried it, the book really took off in certain ways. And in some ways, not always, but in some ways, Arlo was the easiest character to write, or the one who came most naturally. Certainly his childhood came most naturally to me. And so, so one thing was just writing Arlo. And I think I tell it to my students, Doris Betts has an essay called Multiply by Two. If you're stuck in your story, how about adding a new character? See what happens. And I just think that the impulse to censor yourself in the first draft feels to me always a mistake. So that was an early on addition. But then even once Arlo was in there, then I think there were two heavy lifts, but then a lot of sort of medium lifts also. But and one has to do with Arlo, but I'll get to that in a second. But the other thing is that in the draft you saw, Julie, the 753-page behemoth. It probably took about 250 pages to find it for it to be revealed explicitly that Spence had Alzheimer's. But this was a big mistake because the reader knows something's wrong and they're just waiting for Prue to catch up. And that kind of dramatic irony tends to be too thick. It made Prue more obtuse than I think she really was. Right. And it really leached whatever tension there was from the narrative because we knew it was going to happen. So I basically, and what I was doing is I just had a lot of scenes illustrating the same thing. Forgetfulness. Sorry, Joe, so you wanted to jump in?
No, I'm just agreeing. I see what you're saying, that because you felt like that was already explicit, you thought, why not just make it explicit sooner?
Make it, I tend to be biased against, this is a much longer craft discussion. I have problems with it, and I think the big reveal story, the big reveal novel. Not that they can't work, but it doesn't reflect the reading experience. By which I mean, you experience what you experience as you're reading it. And to find out, years ago I had an undergraduate who wrote, and I tell my MFA students this story all the time. I had an undergraduate who wrote a story about, a husband and wife. And then at the end of the story, you find out that the wife is not a wife, but a cat. And you go back and be like, oh, yeah, I guess she was drinking kind of strangely from that saucer. But whatever pleasure that brings you, and I actually don't think it brought me at least that much pleasure. And it was actually a well-written story. It is nonetheless retroactive and retrospective pleasure, and it doesn't reflect the fact that you're actually reading as you're reading. And that's a longer discussion. But I think what I was doing was, and I tell my students this a lot, because I think a lot of us struggle with we sort of are okay with our beginnings and okay with our ends, and in the middle, it's like, what am I going to do in the middle of my story? And I think what a lot of people do is they just move their characters from place to place, and they're doing things that are nominally different. In other words, they're saying different things, they are in different places, but in terms of the overall narrative, the scenes are kind of functioning in the exact same way. But just because I'm good at telling and noticing that in someone else's work doesn't mean I can notice it in my work, at least as quickly as I'd like. And so I think I had a lot of different scenes, all of which illustrated that, Spence was declining. And I just really had to pick and choose and find ones that in some way pushed the narrative forward, that weren't doing different versions of the same thing. So that sort of streamlining was really important. But then I think in some ways the really hardest thing was structural. And for this I have Joan Silber to thank, and I keep meaning to tell Joan this, and she might even be on this Zoom. So if she is, thank you, Joan. And if she's not, then I will tell her some other time. But I was asked to blurb Joan's book, Improvement. And for the life of me, I can't remember what it was about. I know what I loved about that book, but I can't remember what it was about that book that gave me this inspiration. But there was something about reading that book that made me figure out in year 6 how to structure this book. Because and to me, there's a lot to learn from Alice Munro, but one thing there is to learn from Alice Munro is that structure, if it's done well, can be beautiful. And that, people think, oh, structure, I got to structure, got to have structure, got to have a plot. But I'm like, no, no, no. Structure can really be beautiful. What you reveal when, what you tell when, how you order your scenes, how you deal with time. I mean, this book has a very complicated relationship to time. But the big struggle for this book, and the heaviest lift of all, I think, was, Arlo disappears for years at a time. Really only sporadic contact, and yet he is essential to the book. So how do you make someone be both essential and invisible? I mean, obviously you can do it by having characters think about someone who's absent, but I didn't only want to do that, and that does only so much work. And so it was really on some level about, where I place the Arlo scenes and how the book is now in 8 different sections. And in an earlier, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, because for those of you who haven't read it, it's going to be meaningless. But just basically in earlier versions, there is much more of a kind of, a pinballing kind of quality, where there'd be like 10 pages, here and now in medical school in LA with Sarah, and 10 pages as Spence is declining, and 15 pages when Arlo is in high school struggling to learn vocabulary words. And there was just something too herky-jerky about that, and I wasn't able to reflect both the importance of Arlo's presence and the importance of his absence. And once I was able to figure out the structure, and it seems so obvious in retrospect, as everything in retrospect in both fiction and life seems, but never feels obvious in the moment, then, once I did that heavy lift, then the weight was not so heavy. So anyway, yeah.
That's great, and so helpful to hear as one is in the midst of revision oneself. But I would love for us to go to Q&A now, because I see a bunch of questions appearing, and I really want to open up this discussion to our audience. If you haven't posed a question yet and you'd like to, please throw one into the Q&A field there, and we will address them as we have time. So, Josh, if you don't mind my going ahead and throwing you a couple of questions now, would that be okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with this one. This is really interesting. How does being a teacher of creative writing affect the way you create your own books? What are some of the things that you find yourself thinking about because of your teaching, and how does that move into your own writing?
Yeah, so, I feel like in a lot of ways, I was a teacher before I was a writer. I come from a family of teachers, and my father was a teacher, and both my brothers are teachers. And, I always wanted to write fiction, but I just thought that wasn't realistic. I mean, I kind of wanted to play in the NBA also, and, at a certain point you realize that you're neither tall enough nor good enough. And I kind of felt the same way about fiction writing. And so, but after college, I moved out to Berkeley, and I was working for a magazine there. And one of my jobs was to be the first reader of fiction manuscripts. And I saw how terrible so many of them were. And I didn't necessarily think I could do any better, but I thought if other people were willing to try and risk failure, I should be willing to try and risk failure too. And so I started to take some workshops. I started to write, and I went and got my MFA. But I say all this because I feel like I had to teach myself to become a more intuitive writer. And I know it sounds like an oxymoron to teach yourself to be more intuitive, but I actually don't think it is an oxymoron. David Foster Wallace, who in addition to being a writer was a serious amateur tennis player. Years ago, the Times Magazine had a sports section a few times a year, and he interviewed Roger Federer. He did a profile on Federer, and he talked about Federer's learned intuition. And I think that's really true. You hit the ball over and over and over again, and what you're doing, non-instinctively becomes instinctive. So this is a long-winded way of saying that that teaching helps me write every day. That I'm a kid of 2 lawyers. I studied Talmud growing up. I think analytically. I much prefer revision to first draft. I need to write those 3,000 pages I mean, the 3,000 pages are the down payment so that I can get to the revision. The last 2 years of writing are always the best. I really like, I mean, there's different kinds of revision, but I like playing with the sentences. That's what I love most. But you can't play with the ornamentation, the doorpost, until you have the foundation, or else your house is going to collapse. So I'm not really answering your question, but I guess what I'm saying is that every day, I think that that teaching is about teaching people to revise, and every day what I'm telling my students is what I'm learning for myself. And I'm not just saying as I do. I mean, obviously, I've been doing this longer than they have, but I feel like in deep ways, I learn as much from them as they do from me. The mistakes they're making are the mistakes that I'm making. A psychoanalyst friend of mine talks about that the analyst is in the pool with a patient. It's not, the analyst is not outside the pool. And I feel like that's true. That's true with writing instruction. The writing instructor is in the pool with the writer up in workshop. So I'm a relatively social person, so I think I would like to teach for other reasons too, beyond the ways it helps me write, because writing is isolating. But I think just in a purely instrumental way, I think that I'm always figuring things out for my own work, for my teaching. I think I'd be a much worse writer if I weren't a teacher. I don't think that's true of everyone. I think there are people who are more naturally intuitive writers than me, but because I'm someone who had to teach myself to become intuitive, I feel teaching is so integral to that.
That's great. Here's a question from Jay Chakrabarty. What's something you learned about craft or something that surprised you in writing this novel?
Count on Jai. I believe Jai was in my first or second craft class I ever taught. So count on Jai to stump me. I guess I'm gonna feel like I'm avoiding this question. I don't think there's one single thing that I learned. I think what happens is that you make the same mistakes over and over again in different manifestations. And so, for instance, I was saying before, so Julie, you went to Iowa when Frank Conroy was the director. And, Frank has the famous backpack metaphor, where, for those of you who don't know about this metaphor, so basically the idea is that the writer is giving the reader a backpack, and the writer puts in a lot of rocks in the backpack, and then the reader climbs up a mountain, gets to the top of the mountain, unpacks the backpack, and when the reader unpacks the backpack, it should be clear why those rocks were in the backpack. And as Julie and a few others will tell you, there were way too many rocks in the backpack that Julie first carried up the mountain when the book was 753 pages long.
But I got so strong carrying it. Right?
It built us all up, but maybe not. Well, and I appreciate you having carried that backpack. But the reason I'm raising this is that, and what Frank Conroy is talking about is he's saying, your rocks can be really beautiful, but just because they're beautiful rocks doesn't mean they belong in the backpack. Just because something happened doesn't mean it belongs in your book. It's what he calls abject naturalism. And so a lot of what I was mentioning before, when I realized that I was just writing the same scene over and over again in different manifestations of it, I was guilty of abject naturalism. Now, did I not know about Frank Conroy's backpack metaphor before I wrote this book? Absolutely, I did. And yet, I still made the abject naturalism mistake. So I guess, unfortunately, I'm learning the same lessons over and over again in different permutations. And so I don't really feel like I'm learning a lot that's new. I'm just learning it again. I'm a dumb student, and it has to be drilled into me over and over again.
But isn't there a way in which every new book has to teach you its lessons individually? I mean, you can learn sort of collectively about the craft of writing, but then every narrative is different, and the way you interact with every narrative is different. And if you're challenging yourself and doing something that's a little too hard, which is what we tell our students they should be trying to do, you're going to have to relearn the questions every
Oh,
time.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, I don't mean to imply that the lesson is exactly the same, but I guess that's part of it. Well, I think of myself as a short story writer, despite all evidence to the contrary. I teach the story workshops. I I teach the craft class in the short story. I mean, I have taught a novel workshop in the past, but I don't really like doing that because I kind of feel, this is echoing what you're saying, Julie, is I kind of feel that every novel is sui generis and that it's kind of, I feel like there's things to learn from one story to another story, things to learn from a story for a novel. I guess I'm sure I've learned things from writing the novels I've written, but I'm not sure I can say what they are. Whereas with stories, I can really can really talk to you about the kinds of things the kind of craft lessons that you can learn that I think you can transport from one story to the next. That's why I believe MFA programs are about stories. Even if you're a novel writer, I think there's a whole lot to learn about stories. So yeah, I probably learned something from this novel. I'm sure I did. But I actually think that the real things you learn from novel to novel are less about craft and are more about psychology. Like, so Yale Doctor talks about writing a novel as being like, driving. You can drive from New York City to San Francisco on Route 80. You get on the GW, take Route 80 to the Bay Bridge, and then you're there. And Doctor says that writing a novel is like driving across the country in the middle of the night, and you can only see as far as your headlights illuminate. But if you keep driving, you hopefully will eventually get there. And I kind of feel that that's true with a novel. You're always flying blind. And I think the only thing that I really have gained from having written the novels I've written is having had the experience in the past of knowing that there was no way I was ever going to make this work. And then I did, so that when I face that feeling again, maybe it'll feel doable, but I'm not even sure it will. It's like, if you're stuck in the woods and you get out, do you feel that the next time you're stuck in the woods, you will get out? I've never been stuck in the woods, but I suspect that if I had and then I got stuck in the woods again, it would be just as scary. But who knows? So I'm sure I learned something from novel to novel, but it's really hard to say.
Well, how about the things that help us along the way? I mean, this question from Manisha Danraj, I think, is to that point. Um, are there writers that inspire your writing or writers you see yourself writing in the tradition of? I mean, this question is kind of in the vein of, are there writers who kind of signpost you out of the woods, for example, when you find yourself lost?
Not really. I wanted to say yes. Not really. And the reason I'd say not, maybe Monroe because of what she does in terms of structure. And the
Mhm.
reason I say that is because I think the struggles I ultimately have, and it's really hard to separate these things, tend to be narrative and structural. And when I nail that, I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty good at living with my characters and getting them to jump off the page. But you need to get them to jump off the page in crucible moments. And so, I mean, there are writers who are inspiring to me, and I mean, there's so many of them. But I mean, I love Elizabeth Strout's work, and I love, and I like these novels that cover big swaths of time, like long marriage. I mean, Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates, or James Salter. So, people talk about Salter as someone. Salter spoke about life is meals, life is weather, and I kind of feel that life is meals and life is weather, and fiction is meals and fiction is weather. You have to write the right meals and right weather. So I guess the things I struggle with tend to be narrative, and I feel like only Monroe really helps me with that. But then all those other writers help me because you read them and their voice and their sensibility. I mean, you can't write without reading a lot. So in a less purely instrumental way, I always turn to writers I love because I love them.
And everyone you mentioned happens also to be carried by Greenlight books.
Everyone who's any good is
Uh,
carried by Greenlight books.
do we have time for one more question, Greenlight books?
Yeah, we have time for one more.
Okay. Um, I think I would like to address Michael Lundress's question. Michael asks, Josh, you said the story that became this novel was based on your mother working at the JCC. Can you talk about how you deal with the struggle of feeling indebted to the truth, especially with regard to biographical details and the conscious uncoupling from the truth that's necessary for writing fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it was a struggle for this book. Um, well, so I mean, I think it's a struggle for any writer in any book to find, you want, I feel all novels, this novel, my first novel, Swimming Across the Hudson, in some narrow sense, might be called more autobiographical, whereas Matrimony and The World Without You, less so. But I kind of think that that's bullshit. And I mean, what I mean is that there's a truth to that, but there's a way in which all fiction has to be autobiographical, has to be emotionally autobiographical, and in some ways, what's made up. I mean, if you're interested in the writer, and I don't know why you should be, because who cares? But if you happen to be, I actually think what they invent is much more interesting than what is true, because what is true is simply just the facts. Anyone can find those out with enough research on Google. But what the writer makes up is psychologically more interesting because that has to do with the writer's fantasies and fears, etc. But I do think that that fiction does need to be emotionally autobiographical, which means it needs to be close enough. It has to be dangerous in some way. It has to be close enough to the emotional truth that you are invested and your soul is on the page. And if it's not, then it could be virtuoso, but no one is going to care. So I tend to err on the side of emotional truth. On the other hand, I do think that writers have to understand that they are writing, that it's an art that they're doing, and there is a kind of aesthetic truth that has to transcend and is more important than actual truth. The first writing workshop I was in as a student, there was a young woman in the class who wrote a story that was transparently autobiographical about her breakup with her first boyfriend. But it was actually a much better story than that thumbnail sketch would suggest. And we all said what we thought was working. Everyone agreed that there was a certain scene that was not working. And when it was her turn to speak, she said, well, that scene that you thought wasn't working, it actually happened. And of course, the appropriate response is a kind, gentle version of so what? That fiction is about getting at a deeper kind of truth. And if the actual truth is going to get in the way of the deeper truth, then you want to write a little more distantly. So you are always trying to find the balance. What is complicated in this particular book, and I think made this harder, and actually you asked Julie about the heavy lift.
Yeah.
Before, and I would say there was an emotional heavy lift. And I'm a little uncomfortable talking about this, but I'm thinking about it. I'm actually okay with talking about this. So, as I said before, my father, late in his life, developed dementia, and more than any other character in the book, Spence resembles my father more than any other character in the book resembles anyone whom I know. But one thing I really struggled with was Walter. And for those of you who haven't read the book, so Walter is a man who in the original version, the early versions, Prue meets at the JCC, and now that the JCC is gone, Prue meets him elsewhere. I don't want to give away too much because it happens in the later parts of the book, but Prue develops, while Spence is alive, Prue develops, or I'll just say a relationship with Walter. And Walter was in the book very early on, but there was, as Julie can attest, and others who can read the book can attest, there was no tension in Walter. there were like some very nicely, I guess, nicely written scenes with Prue and Walter, but the stakes in their relationship were low. There was the implication of possible romance, but I just wasn't willing to go there. And I wasn't willing to go there, I think, for personal reasons, because my mother has always been, and she remains this way to this day, and my father has been dead for 10 and a half years now. She was very, very loyal to my father, to my father's memory. Sorry, I'm getting a little choked up. And yeah, I mean, they had a lovely marriage. Yeah, so she was very loyal to him, and I think I know it was very hard for me to write a book in which he would be recognizable in certain ways as my father, and she would be recognizable in certain ways as my mother, and to have her have Prue take up with another man, which is something that my mother did not do and would not have wanted to do and wouldn't have done even after my father died. And to my mother's credit, she has always been a sensitive mother, but also a sensitive reader. And she was never about, oh, is this me or is that? I mean, she's a sophisticated fiction reader, and she understands the ways in which fiction can borrow from the truth, but can be canted, can be tilted in a way to make it something totally different.
Right.
And I said to my mother at some point, I told her that, because at some point I realized that Prue and Walter needed to get together, and I told her about it. And I said, I want you to know that I know that's not something you did or would have wanted to do. And I said, I place no judgment on Prue, and I place no judgment on you. But I just want you to know that I'm just curious whether you'll be upset to see someone who in some ways resembles you, but who, made a different choice from the choice you made. She said she had no problem with it. And I think that it was really to her credit. And I still feel that. A postscript to that, interestingly, is that, so anyway, so that was the emotional heavy lift. And that, to answer your question, Michael, was the emotional difficulty in this particular book. I guess I'd say I'm very fortunate in general to have family members who are supportive of my work in all ways, and who, I mean, people joke about the ways that, certain family members of writers will feel like they're too much in the book, they're not enough in the book, they're the paranoids, they're the delusionals. And my family is none of that. They've been very supportive of me in all ways, all along. But what was interesting about this emotional challenge of this book is that, so when I finally embraced Walter and Prue and Walter's relationship, that was another way that the book really took off. But I discovered something, which is that Prue remains incredibly loyal to Spence, perhaps even more loyal to him because of her relationship with Walter. I mean, that's for the reader to decide. But I think I kind of adopted my mother's take on things, which that it was a kind of betrayal on Prue's part of Spence. And now, having written this book and having written that section, I no longer feel that. I don't feel like it's the only choice someone could have made, but I feel like it's a choice that is consonant with loyalty. And so that was something I really learned from my characters. And I think I learned something in retrospect about certain things I thought about my own family from putting my characters in motion and seeing them make different choices.
Thank you so much, Josh. I just am honored to be able to have heard you talk about the book in so much detail, and to have had so many of my own questions answered. I'm glad we could address a number of the audience members' questions, but really what I would love is for everyone here, the more than 300 people in the audience, to buy this incredible book and then to buy it again and give it to everyone you know. I absolutely adore this novel, and I'm just so excited that finally everyone will be able to have it in their hands. So thank you so much for reading and for answering so generously, and for inviting me to participate in this launch.
And Julie, I also want to thank you for talking. I mean, I want to thank you for talking to me in general. You know, as a friend and as a fellow writer, our drives home from Brooklyn College, where we talk about our lives and about our work, have been really, really important to me. So thank you.
Thank you. Me too.
Thank you so much, Joshua and Julie, for tonight's incredible conversation. And thank all of you for sharing this space tonight with us for Conversation Connection. A reminder to buy Josh's book through Greenlight. You can get Morningside Heights. If you're local to Brooklyn, you can stop by the bookstores. Joshua will be coming by and signing tomorrow. So starting tomorrow, we're open noon to 7 every day, and you can just slip by the store and get a signed copy. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com. I'm putting that buy link back in the chat. And you can just include any signing or even personalization requests in order comments at checkout. And you can order a signed copy of Morningside Heights online. Thank you so much again, everyone, for coming out virtually tonight, and have a wonderful